Good morning readers and welcome to Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to a new thing that I'm going to be doing on this channel, which is Bookish Breakfast. So as I was talking about in my update video, the thing that I struggle with finding time to do is planning videos and editing videos. Like, the filming doesn't take very long, so this is going to be a minimally planned video series that is also not edited, so the only time it takes is the filming and obviously the reading, which I'm doing anyway. So I'm going to talk about roughly the bookish things that have happened in the week preceding the video, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I've got a couple of different books that I'm going to mention today. First of all, to start out with, when I posted my update video just over a week ago, I had like 299 subscribers when I was filming that, and I know because I referenced that in the video, and I now have like 440. So yeah, welcome to those of you who have now subscribed. I think it's because Katie from Books and Things said something very, very nice, so thank you, Katie, about me in a booktuber shout out video that she did. But if there is any other reason why you have subscribed to this channel, just let me know in the comments so that I know, you know, who's been nice to me, basically. And welcome, and I hope that you will find something enjoyable on here. So, what's happened? What have I been reading in the last week? So, just over a week ago, probably, I finished the audiobook of Unequal Affections by Lara S. Ormiston. I found out about this book from Jane Austen July, and if you were part of Jane Austen July, you will know what it's about, because a lot of people read it for that and said that it was really good. So it is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, in which Lizzie accepts Mr. Darcy the first time he asks her. So she accepts him at the parsonage at Hunsford, and their relationship builds from that point. So everyone was saying really nice things about this, so I really wanted to get hold of it. The paperback for some reason was like £50 on Amazon, but Beau has got Audible and he very kindly let me use one of his credits to get the audiobook. I didn't really like the narrator. I didn't really, I feel like when you're listening to a book on audiobook, the flaws are more, I was going to say visible, but audible, than they would be if you were just reading, because you can skim past things that you don't like so much, but when they are spoken aloud, they kind of grate on you a little bit more. And this book did grate on me a bit. So I read it as like somebody's Mr. Darcy fantasy that they turned into a book. It doesn't really work for me as a story. So one thing that I thought before I started it was that they would have to change the story a tiny bit in the run-up to Mr. Darcy's proposal. So I thought that they would skip out the point where I think it's Colonel Fitzwilliam tells Lizzie that it's Darcy's fault that Bingley and Jane didn't get together, that Darcy broke up Bingley and Jane, effectively. And I thought that they would remove that part so that she wouldn't be so angry with him and so against him. And there would just be the thing about Wickham and her general personal dislike for him, rather than that very moving personal thing that she thinks that I think she says he's ruined perhaps forever the happiness of a most beloved sister. Like, that is something that is very emotionally important to Lizzie. And they didn't change that. So I thought it would be that she would find out about that later on, and that would be like a plot point that, oh, I said I'm going to marry this guy, but it turns out that he's done this really awful thing. Whereas I find it difficult to believe that she would be unangry enough with him to accept him, having just that day found out what he did to Bingley and Jane. Spoilers for Pride and Prejudice, by the way. The other thing that I really didn't like was there was way too much kissing. So if you think about the romantic power of Jane Austen's novels, she achieves all of that without any kissing, and it's all about like the way that characters interact, the way that they talk to each other, the way that they think about each other. From the protagonist, we get to see what the protagonist is thinking about the male hero, I suppose. We get all of that, but we don't get any physical contact between the man and the woman. In Unequal Affections, there's like loads of like hair stroking and smooching and just general like physical interaction. And I get it's because they're engaged, so there is a little bit more license for that, but I felt like it was taken a little bit too much, and the kind of romantic payoff that you got from each kiss in terms of like the way that it made you feel in the story was very much diminished, because it was just like every time the author could find an excuse, then she was having like one of them be a bit kissy to the other one, and that didn't work for me at all in this context. One thing I did like was the way that the character of Wickham was used, in that Lizzie doesn't know anything bad about him yet because she's not had Darcy's letter, so he is still kind of almost like desirable to her. And then Wickham still has this motivation to have a revenge on Darcy. So I did like that aspect. And on the whole, I did enjoy the process. Like, I was wanting to listen to more of it, but I just felt like it wasn't very well done. On the topic of people reworking the idea of things, of Jane Austen's ideas, ITV have obviously just started this new version of Sanditon. So Sanditon was Jane Austen's last major piece of writing that she was never finished, and it is set in a seaside town, possibly similar to Worthing, which is really close to where I grew up. That is like trying to become a seaside health resort. It is very satirical and very like bitterly witty. It's like Persuasion, but even more bitter. For the first chunk that is there, it's almost like farce. And somebody has come along and said, right, we're going to turn this into a full-length story. And there are interesting parts of Sanditon that I can see why you would want to turn them into a full-length story. It is the only work by Jane Austen that has got a mixed-race character as like a prominent figure, so I think that they're going to be playing a lot around that theme and that like interesting aspect. Is it Andrew Davies, who did the Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth and the lake, so there's going to be a little bit more of that kind of thing, and obviously we've already had like the sea bathing. I was able to watch the first episode of this. We don't have a TV here in our house here, but I was visiting my parents, so I was able to watch the first episode. I did enjoy it. I found that they have cut already, of the very limited amount that Jane Austen wrote, they have actually cut a whole chunk of that already, which is like, you know, you could have just created a whole new thing if you wanted to, but you wanted to call it Jane Austen, so, you know, you could use the stuff that she wrote. But yeah, so one of the things that bothered me was they just don't quite have the dialogue right. So every time that somebody bumped into a new person, they'd be like, well met, like every single time. And by the end of the episode, I was just sat there thinking, what's wrong with good morning? Like, seriously. Anyway, so that was Sanditon. Also on the topic of like adaptations, Bo and I are watching the most recent version of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I'm going to say that it is Gemma Arterton, and it's maybe like 2008, but I didn't write that down. I didn't write that much down, really. So I couldn't say for sure whether it is Gemma Arterton or not. But it's a really good version. So we're watching that because Bo's just listened to Tess of the D'Urbervilles for the first time on audiobook, which I'm really happy with because he's not really... he's not a reader, if that makes sense, but he does read more than me at the moment because he uses Audible on his commutes to and from work, and he has like started to branch out into areas of literature that he otherwise probably wouldn't have done through using the audiobooks, which is really exciting for me because then we get to talk about books that I love so much, and I do absolutely love Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It's right up there with my like favourite books. So we're watching this adaptation, and actually watching this is making me hate Angel Clare a lot. So I'm not going to go into any spoilers, but there is this character called Angel who is a guy who comes in and he's a bit of like the romantic hero, but when I was reading this as a teenager, which is when I read it the most, I always saw him as that. Even though there are problematic aspects of things that he does, I always saw him as like the good guy. But now I see him as very much related to another one of the characters who I really don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but who is very much a forceful negative character. And I now see that Angel himself is also very forceful and not very sensitive towards the woman that he claims to love. So I really feel like I'm building up to a reread of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I'm not sure whether there's going to be time for that anytime soon, but I would like to do it. Continuing on the theme of adaptations, so I've obviously watched a lot more things than I've read in the last week or so. Last night, Bo and I watched Hamlet, so this is the version with David Tennant that was put on by the RSC, and then the BBC filmed it So it was like a stage production that was then filmed, and I think they introduced like 2 or 3 more sets, but most of it is as it was. I'm gonna see if I've got the date on here, 2009. Yeah, 2009. So I saw that when it was in theatres. I think my parents took us along to it, and really loved it as a stage production. And I've always wanted to get hold of the DVD and just watch it at home because it was so good. I remember it being so good, and the fact that they did film it and that you could take it home and watch it again has always put that in my head. And then just recently I had this thought that like, we could just buy it. Like, I don't need to be always thinking of it and thinking, I wish I had a copy of that. Like, I'm an adult, I can just put in an Amazon order. So Bo actually found it and he bought it. And we watched it last night and it was really good. It's very emotional, but also very accessible. So Hamlet is obviously this long play that has a reputation for being quite like dense and pontificating, and you know, the plot is maybe slightly confusing, but it's not. It's very real. It's a modern dress adaptation, but they kept all of the old language. Some bits like really make you laugh, like Polonius, the way that character is acted, you just get the frustration of all of the characters around him. And it also just made me think about the character of Gertrude. So Gertrude is Hamlet's mum who marries his uncle. And I was thinking about her being in actually a very difficult position, because it's suggested that she was already having this adulterous relationship with his uncle, but if she wasn't, and her husband, who was the king, died, in terms of like the stability of the kingdom and her own position, the safest thing for her to do is to marry his uncle, even if she's not actually in love with him. It seems to me that she is pushed into that role. And I thought that the way that Gertrude is played in this version, where she is shown to be quite conflicted, and at the end quite knowing of the situation that's happening when they're having this duel, I really enjoyed that. So I'm gonna probably watch that again soon. It was kind of like a prelude to Shake Tube that I'm not really gonna be participating in. So that was a good thing. Moving on to some things that I've actually been reading. I've obviously still been reading Light in August for the Faulkner in August read-along. I have got up to midway through chapter 16 and I'm just taking a little bit of a break, so I am falling behind quite a long way compared to everybody else. But it's quite a dense book and I've got other things going on and I'm just trying to like gradually read it. I filmed while I was in Brighton, so I went down to see my parents. My mum and I filmed a kind of discussion of the story so far that I need to edit, because me and my mum, we get talking, we've talked for about 40 minutes on it, so I need to kind of like cut it and make it comprehensible. Yeah, it's still a really good book that I am enjoying, but just decided to put it down for a little while because I got a snarky text from the library and they would like me to give back The Lightless Sky by Gulwali Passarlay. So this is a story about a boy who left Afghanistan age 12, who was sent by his mum, who paid some traffickers to take him to Europe. And I got this out on the recommendation of somebody who, I can't remember who, and I'm sorry, from the video that I did called On People and Borders, in which I talked about some of the voluntary work that I've been doing in Calais and around Calais with providing first aid to refugees and migrants who are camping there, who are not having any home or shelter or formal medical care. And I just wanted to do some more reading around that area and to understand it a little bit better. And somebody said to read The Lightless Sky. So it's kind of like a memoir of his journey. So yeah, I've had this out for a long time and I've been reading it like a tiny bit at a time. I think I wanted to have a little bit of space after coming back from Calais the last time. I didn't feel like I wanted to be reading it just at that point, just because I wanted to give a little bit of a break and a little bit of distance to myself for that. But yeah, then I got this snarky text from the library saying, please bring it back, which is fair enough because it's quite overdue. I think I got it out in June and it's now late August. So I decided to pick it up again. I'm about maybe a third of the way through. The writing style sometimes leaves something to be desired. I think he's obviously had like a ghostwriter or somebody supporting him to write it. And like a lot of these kind of like, it's like somebody's wanting to emphasize it as a bit of like a sob story, which obviously it's a journey of intense hardship. There is nothing easy about what he had to do as a teenager and a child to travel that distance. But I think sometimes people write it in a bit of an emotive way because that's what they think will sell. What I'm finding really interesting so far is how he's talking about his kind of upbringing in Afghanistan, with the crossover between he had some experiences in very rural areas with his grandparents and in a more like modern city area with his parents, with his dad having the role of a doctor. So that kind of like the kind of intersection between different parts of the culture, and talking about like differences in experience under the Taliban versus under the US occupation. And he talks about like how his upbringing affected his opinion. So talking about how he actually felt like it was a good thing when his sisters stopped going to school, and his reasonings for that as like a 12-year-old who had been brought up in this context. Now he is on his journey. It is really, it's an adventure story, but very, very real, like obviously real. And it's very interesting the way that he experiences his journey as a child, with the balance between being very, very homesick and also very excited by the new things that he sees, and the way that his fellow travellers become kind of like a surrogate family to him. So that's interesting so far. Also, continuing the theme of reading around migration, I picked up this in the train station on one of my train journeys. It was £7, which is more than I've paid for a book in ages, and it is in fact a magazine. It's the National Geographic. I used to read the National Geographic from time to time because I think my dad used to buy it, but I haven't read one in ages. And what I'm really finding is that the writing is amazing and the pictures are amazing. Like, I don't regret spending £7 on this because I think it is really, really worth it. So this is a special issue called World on the Move. So a lot of the articles are focusing on themes of migration. I've got a picture here. This is Turkey in 2014, of a refugee camp. And I'm just really appreciating the amount of effort and research and the facts that this is presenting, because I think that the way that we hear about migration is always quite skewed. Oh, here is an amazing graphic. So this is like, it's really hard to show, but the white is net inflow of migrants, or the black is net outflow of migrants, if that makes sense. And it's country by country, so which countries have more people leaving, which countries have more people arriving. And I think there is a certain narrative that we're presented of the way that migration works in the world that is very politically motivated. So we hear a lot about people coming to Europe, and we hear a lot about people coming to the United States, but we don't really hear about people migrating from Uzbekistan to Russia in search of work, or we don't really hear about people migrating from Africa to like the Arab Gulf states in search of work, often in ways that are both about economic migration but also about escaping a very difficult political situation in a way that could be considered being a refugee, if that was, but going to a country where it's not possible to claim asylum. I think I'm not talking about this very clearly, but basically if you see this and if you're at all interested in finding out a little bit more about migration and migrant experiences, then I would recommend checking it out. One thing that is coming out in some of the articles and some of the kind of interviews and discussions with people that are included in those articles is the way that you present your story as a migrant who has arrived in a country to the people back home. And that came up a lot in African Titanics, which I read for the same reasons, and The Runaways. I think that's by Sanjeev Sahota, that I also read because it's about migration. So African Titanics is about Eritrean people coming to Europe, and The Runaways is about Indian people coming specifically to Britain. And it talks about, in both of those, how the message that is sent back is one that is always positive and often a little bit not exactly truthful. So people do not send back a very accurate story of themselves, because you don't want to send back a story to your family saying, I'm homeless and I'm picking tomatoes for pennies, because that's not the story that you want to tell them. Like, that you as a family unit have spent so much and invested so much to get you somewhere where you're supposed to have a better life, and actually the life that you are living once you arrive is not not that great. Even if you are still, like, some of the men in here talk about how, you know, they can send €100 home each month, so that is still worth it for them. But they also don't want their family at home to know that they don't have their own house, their own car, their own television. So they're, like, taking pictures of other people's cars in order to, like, say, oh, you know, I'm doing well here. So I found that very interesting. I'm about halfway through the magazine, so I will enjoy reading the rest of that. So what else? So I mentioned that I went home to Brighton this weekend. I actually went home via London. So one of my birthday presents from Beau was to go to Harry Potter World, if I can say it. Harry Potter World? What was that? So we are reading the Harry Potter books together over the course of this year. We're up to The Order of the Phoenix, which is the worst book in the series. We're near the end of it, thank goodness. But it's just a dreadful book. You could cut it out and the series would be better off with it. Like, the whole prophecy thing doesn't work for me, doesn't make any sense. There's whole chapters that are just Harry complaining about his exams. It just goes nowhere, this book. It just drags. Like, I like Umbridge, and I like the kind of, the character of Umbridge. I like pretty much nothing else about this. And I get it's about, like, Harry being a teenager and having a little while where you can see him as a teenager, and he's also, he's getting possessed by Voldemort, so he's also being really moody, but it's just a bad book. It's just a really, really bad book. It needs a hell of an edit. So we were reading a little bit more of that on our way down to London, and then we went round Harry Potter World, which I've never been to before, and I actually really enjoyed. So we love going to museums, and Harry Potter World is basically a museum, not just of Harry Potter, but also of, like, special effects, visual effects, the way that films work. So what I found was I watched Sanditon after having been to Harry Potter World, and I was looking at different things in the background and being like, oh yeah, I reckon that's how they did that background, or I reckon that's how they would have done that costume. Because a lot of it is about, like, how did they make a goblin costume? How did they make, you know, people look how they looked? How did they work on fabrics to make the fabrics look right for the scene that they were in? So I found that all really interesting. I think we were there for like 9 hours, which I never would have thought I would get enough enjoyment out of a Harry Potter museum to stay for 9 hours, but it was great. Yeah. Then the final thing that I wanted to mention, as if this little ramble wasn't long enough already, was some bookish acquisitions that I've had in the last couple of days. So it was my birthday, and people get me books for my birthday. So my aunt got me 2 books which were related to the course I'm going to start on tropical nursing. She got me Humanitarian Negotiations Reveal the MSF Experience, which is, I mean, what it says in the title, basically, like, how they work with states to enable access to provide medical care, and the kind of grey ethical line that can present. I've had this recommended in an online course that I did called Health and Humanitarian Crisis, that was also by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This was referenced in that, and I just thought it sounded really interesting, so I can't remember now. I heard about it for some reason, and I thought it sounded very relevant, so now I'm going to read that. It's going to be quite dense. I don't think I'm going to read it cover to cover. She also got me War Doctor by David Tennant, and this is I guess a kind of a memoir or autobiography of this man, David Tennant, who's a vascular surgeon who has then gone out and worked with MSF and developed techniques for dealing with emergency trauma cases in war zones. So that is going to be interesting as well. Then I got a couple of books secondhand. I got Death Comes to Pemberley because, again, people were talking about it in Jane Austen in July, and apparently it's not all that good, but I've read things by P.D. James before and not found them too bad, and I just thought, you know, why not? It'll not take very long to read. Then, while I was at home in Brighton with my parents, we also came up to London and we went to this English heritage place called Eltham Palace, which is like a really opulent 1930s mansion created by these American millionaires. It's really gorgeous, and it looks like straight off an Agatha Christie set. Like, there are these like holes in the walls and the stairs, and you can just see someone like standing on the stairs and seeing someone get murdered or overhearing something that they shouldn't have overheard. So I I'm sure they must have filmed a Poirot there or something. And they had, like, in a little room at the back, they had a secondhand bookshop. And my mum was like, let's not go in there because we'll just end up buying something, let's not go. And I was like, how can we not? How can we not? So we went in, and I did end up buying 2 books. I bought a translation of the Upanishads, which is something that I've been looking for a while. It's quite an old translation, but any translation is better than nothing, which is what I've got at the moment. So I'm just trying to expand my library of, I guess, myths and classical works that are not from England and Europe. So that should be good for that. And one that's like the Legacy of the Middle Ages. It's like an old Oxford edition, you know, the ones with like the blue covers and the gold writing on the covers. That was published in the 1940s, and it's got this inscription of somebody's name and like 1944 in it, and it was £1 and I couldn't say no, and it's got some beautiful like colour plates in it as well, so that's just a nice bookish item. But I've left those 2 in Brighton because I couldn't physically carry all of those books up with me. And I need to try and not buy so many books because we've already got loads and loads of books. But it's okay because Beau likes building bookshelves, so, you know, I'm just making projects for him. So thank you very much for joining me for Bookish Breakfast today. It's quite a late breakfast for me because I am working nights tonight. But I hope that you all have a lovely day, and that this hasn't been too boring, and that it was all right for you to hear me say about 50,000 times. And yeah, thank you for watching. Goodbye.